Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this learning experience brought to you by AWS and Caston by Veeam. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting PulseMeter review today, but before we get that PulseMeter under review, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. So first off, today's session is being recorded. So if you'd like to rewatch our program at a later point in time, or maybe you want to share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. If you would like to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so, and they are all on the right side of your screen. The first option you'll see is the chat tab, and I'd like you to go ahead and test out that function for us by letting us know from where in the world you are joining from. If you have any specific questions, we do want you to send those into the Q&A tab. Sending in your questions to the Q&A just helps us keep track of our questions, and we want to answer as many as we can today. So feel free to send those in early and often. If you click the handouts tab, you'll see not only a version of our slides, which are a portion of our PulseMeter report, but there's also the full PulseMeter report there as well. So feel free to grab those. And of course, before we close things out, we're giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around for the duration of our conversation. Our topic today is how Kubernetes backup and resilience enables application modernization, and I'm joined today by Matt Slotten, Principal Solutions Architect for Cloud Native Partnerships at Caston by Veeam, Mike McDonald, AWS Partner Solutions Architect at AWS, and leading our conversation is Mike Rothman, Chief Strategy Officer of Techstrong Group and GM of Techstrong Research, who carried out the polls and the research for our PulseMeter today. So Matt, Mike, thank you all so much for coming here today. Mr. Rothman, would you like to go ahead and kick us off?
Thank you, Cody. Hey, everybody, what's going on? Mike Rothman here, General Manager of Techstrong Research, and I'm really excited to be here for the Kubernetes Backup and Resilience Enabling Application Modernization event that we're doing with our pals from Caston by Veeam and AWS. So let me just give a little bit of perspective before we kind of dive into the data. And we've got pie charts. We have a couple of bar charts, no line charts. I'm not a big fan of line charts. I like the big bars. I'm a beefy, type of bar chart type of guy. So we've got plenty of data here. But before we get into that, what you found over the last couple of months has been a whole mess of events and activities out of Techstrong Research, typically partnered with our friends at AWS around application modernization. And you got to think, well, why, right? Why is it such an interesting topic now? Why is it something that everybody needs to know about? And that's because, as you can tell, I'm not, kind of a spring chicken anymore, right? Lots of gray hair. I've earned all the road rash that I've had from 30 something years in the technology space. And what we're doing is going through another one of these waves of innovation that are requiring us to really rationalize the infrastructure that we have, right? I started when it was really in mainframe land, and we're going to have an event about that fairly soon, but it gave way to client server, and then, kind of fat client internet applications, then multi-tier internet applications. And now we've got stuff in the cloud and SaaS and all of these different things. And with each one of these transitions, you have to really rationalize the infrastructure that you already have. Right. So this whole modernization effort is really about taking a look, not necessarily at the infrastructure, that's an important part of it, but also the code that rides on top of that. And by the way, a lot of what we're doing now is increasingly becoming code, even if it's infrastructure. So this whole infrastructure as code thing continues to, really become more prevalent. A lot of cloud native. We're here with the Cloud Native Now website and media site that we have at Techstrong. So, modernization is a big theme for ours. And Kubernetes is really, kind of one of these technologies that has really taken off. We'll get into that in about a minute. But before we keep going, let me give my esteemed panelists a minute or two to introduce themselves, as well as talk a little bit about what it is that they do on a daily basis. Maybe a little bit about your background. I mean, whatever you want to do. Let's kind of get so you get a feel for who these folks are. Matt, why don't we start with you? So Matt Slotten from our pals at Caston by Veeam.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. And I feel like I need to shoot Cody an Amazon gift card just for having to pronounce my title, because I know it's a long one. So thanks, Cody. And thanks, Mike. Yeah, super excited to be here, guys, today. Name's Matt Slotten. I work at Caston by Veeam. A little bit about myself. I'm based in Atlanta. However, I'm in sunny Boston today. My background, I'm come from an infrastructure background, but I've dabbled in security, dabbled in physical, then virtual infrastructure, hyperconverged, and then obviously latest and greatest is code applications and cloud native technologies. Outside of work, which is a passion, I have a fair number of hobbies, which my wife likes to give me a hard time that I've got too many. But you can find me on the racetrack. I'm a high performance driving instructor. You can find me out my motorcycle or playing with model trains. That is still a hobby. Some people still do it. I am one of them. So happy to be here and excited to participate.
A true Renaissance man. I had no idea, Matt, from just the limited interaction we have. That's fantastic. Keep up those hobbies, because life gets in the way, and you turn around and you end up in your mid-50s going, what happened to those trains I had? They've been in a box somewhere, in some storage unit somewhere. So, Mike McDonald from AWS, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you have going on as well?
All right. Hey, everyone. Mike McDonald. I'm based out of Seattle. I'm a partner solutions architect with AWS, and I'm part of our containers specialist community. So I work with our, partners and individual customers, kind of trying to, optimize their container infrastructure, get them brushed up on best practices, do some enablement so that they can build better in the cloud. And, in my own time, it's interesting that Matt's also kind of a car guy, because I am as well. I've got a couple of project cars that I like to work on, and also do a lot of outdoorsy stuff. Since up here in Seattle, we've got 3 national parks in the state, so a lot of hiking and backpacking. So yeah, glad to be on.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. All right, guys. So Mike, you kind of provided a great segue. We're really here to talk about both application modernization and really kind of Kubernetes as that platform that folks are really using as a mechanism to start to, kind of kickstart those efforts, right? So, and just to give everybody a little bit of a background on the whole PostMeter process that we have. What we do is we work with our clients, in this case, it's Caston by Veeam and AWS, and we come up with a set of questions that we use and preview on the website that you folks, right, all the listeners that are out there will provide your opinion on. We go back into the, kind of the laboratory, assemble a bunch of charts and the like, pull some conclusions off of those kind of data points, put together the PulseMeter, which again, you can get in your handouts area. And by the way, as Cody mentioned, if you folks have any questions that you have as we go through that, just pop them into the Q&A tab. I am constantly monitoring that. So if interesting stuff comes up, I will bring it forward to our panelists. But the first question, what we really wanted to get at was, how prevalent is Kubernetes? And not just for like, hey, I'm playing with it, because almost everybody's playing with it in some way, shape, or form. But how many folks are actually doing business critical applications? So we thought one interesting way to get at that was phrasing the question, really framing it from the percentage of business critical apps. So it's not, hey, we're playing around with it. And this is kind of instructive, right? If you have less than 10%, you're pretty early on, in terms of your adoption. If you've got 91 to 100%, you're clearly on the most likely bloody edge, right? It's not even bleeding, it's just bloody at that point in terms of making this stuff work at scale with the reliability that you need. So we really wanted to get a feel for that. And our numbers were, again, as you would kind of expect, about 50% of folks are still pretty early, right? Less than 25% of their business critical apps are running on Kubernetes, right? 15% say, between a quarter and a half. And then you have, basically another 35% that are above 50%. So, if we take this in, what is it, April, May of 2023, when we did the survey, it looks like, one thing. If we were to ask in November and then, May of 2024, I suspect we would have, much different numbers. But any specific conclusions you guys draw on this? Is this representative of what you tend to see in the accounts that you're working with on a daily basis? Matt, do you have an opinion on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, this aligns with what we see commonly. Obviously, like you said, I'd be interested to see if we could do another survey in the next month or so, because we see it adoption increasing basically month over month. And we anticipate actually this time next year to essentially that 33% to rotate around, to have most enterprises looking closer at 50 or above 50%. And which is, it's to your point, it's fascinating. Obviously, it's constantly evolving. So there's a lot to take in. Obviously, a lot of different flavors of Kubernetes. Obviously, EKS is one of the leaders. So thank you, Mike and team there. But yeah, this definitely aligns kind of with what we're seeing in the industry. And kind of a small note too. So Veeam acquired Caston about 2.5 years ago. So Veeam, for those unaware, is a traditional backup, more of a traditional backup company. They obviously do backup O365 and have integrations with Azure. But from a Kubernetes perspective, they see obviously the value of Kubernetes data mobility, backup, and restore, which is a big reason why they invested in Caston.
Yeah, you bet. Mike, consistent with what you're running into day to day working with partners and customers?
Yeah, I would say so. There's been a big push with the requests that we're getting from partners and customers to help, kind of upskill their engineers on, this adoption and moving their stuff to containers, piecemeal, picking off applications that they could containerize and then run in the cloud. And, so there's a big movement towards getting more of these business critical apps onto Kubernetes and onto the container-based architectures.
Yeah, that skills thing, and I think we do get to it a little bit later. But I never like to miss an opportunity to kind of bump something that I think is important to mention. But again, I was kind of there early on in cloud, right? 12, 15 years ago when AWS was first, getting going, and then Azure came into the space. And obviously, we talk a little bit about the different cloud platforms that you have to support as well moving forward. But what's interesting is, kind of a lot of the basis of why cloud was compelling initially, right? The whole managed infrastructure, not having to deal with, kind of hardware and rack and stack and a lot of the networking, the ultimately kind of the softwareization of everything so that you can really program your environment. All those were very compelling use cases for why we went to the cloud, a decade ago. Now we're starting to see a similar type of push towards containers, right? And, Docker was kind of the first shiny thing, but now from an orchestration standpoint, you do see Kubernetes kind of really taking a pretty, commanding in both mind share and, deployments lead in kind of that containerization type of environment. So Mike, do you see kind of, folks wanting to get into Kubernetes, really looking at something like EKS as, a pretty interesting way so that they don't have to know everything about everything? Do they look at a service like Fargate, right, which is really more of a managed, type of environment as a way, to get there? So as folks are looking and saying, hey, I've got business critical stuff I'm doing here, I may not have the ability to, really kind of manage that orchestration layer myself. Are they kind of leaning on you guys to help them out with that?
Absolutely. And we've got our two kind of offerings. We've got ECS, which is, more vendor specific for us, and then EKS, which is our Kubernetes option. And we have a lot of customers that end up going with EKS because they want that, native kind of Kubernetes experience, but they don't want to have to mess with all the management stuff. And with EKS, we manage that control plane side, take some of that heavy lift away, and they can really get into, the bread and butter of what differentiates their business, which is getting these applications, running up in the cloud. And with Fargate, especially, like not having to manage the node groups and that compute, you just kind of tell it, what kind of resources that task is going to need, and then send it on its way, or that pod, I should say. Specific language between the ECS and EKS there, but telling it what resources it needs, as far as your, compute cores and memory, and then sending it on to run in a serverless kind of fashion is, picking up a lot of different folks that want to get straight to, their app deployment.
Yeah, you bet. So obviously Mike's going to talk a little bit about what he lives and breathes every day on the AWS side. Matt, I would guess you run into a variety of other platforms that are there. So again, managed service versus, folks kind of tooling it themselves with, kind of a DIY type of thing. You starting to detect any trends along those lines?
Absolutely, and not to get ahead of ourselves, but yeah, so absolutely see, there's in the industry today, I think we're seeing one of the biggest deficits is kind of Kubernetes or cloud native experience, right? So I think we tend to see a lot of more managed solutions, at least the public cloud providers. Obviously, there's a fair number of enterprises, either due to regulatory compliance requirements where they have to run on-prem, but really we're starting to see also the true embrace of hybrid cloud. So, from a Caston, from an Amazon perspective, I think that's kind of where the sweet spot is, which we can talk about data mobility.
Yep. Well, installed base realities and the fact that you can't migrate every workload at once, all those different things. And again, I've been a security architect for a long time myself and working with a number of folks as they kind of made that transition. It was always interesting as folks got the first dozen up and then you talk to them, hey, and this was, probably 3-4 years ago. They're like, yeah, we've got 20 applications up there. And, so what are you planning for next year? 100. What about the year after that? 400. You're just like, wait, right? So, you start to really see that hockey stick. But, and I think a lot of folks get all enamored with, kind of, oh, let's get to the cloud. Oh, let's get to Kubernetes and all that kind of stuff. And they forget about a lot of the systems that are required in order to make these things truly enterprise or business critical, as we talk about here. And of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about backup and resilience, because not only is that the focus of what we're here to talk about, it's one of those things that you tend not to think about until you have to think about it. And when you think about it, it's probably not great, right? It's kind of like security in a lot of ways. It's like when nothing happens, that's a great day, right? If you're sitting there trying to dig into your, backup strategy and trying to start to poke on how you're doing resilience, either you're somewhat unique in being proactive or you've gotten yourself into a little bit of a jam. Right. So let's talk a little bit. Our next question was really, how do you currently manage the backup and disaster recovery process for your Kubernetes workloads? So what's interesting, a little horrifying, to be honest with you, but, pretty interesting, kind of that bottom box, right? Not currently managing backups, 17%. So these are the folks that rely on divine intervention, right? Because if something were to happen in their workloads, if something were to happen, to their environment, they're hoping that, again, maybe it shows up on a white horse with wings. Maybe it's, a train that shows up. I don't know, right? But, kind of not currently managing backups, that's a little bit scary. But everything else is kind of mixed, right? Cloud provider backup solutions are, the highest with 33%, but we got manual scripts and processes and a mix of cloud and on-prem backup being at 19%, and then traditional on-prem being 12%. And Matt, you kind of, I think, alluded to really the answer, which is it's not traditional on-prem backup. Kind of making those tools work in the cloud and work in Kubernetes is really an unnatural act. And obviously that's why Veeam, decides they need to not rebut, kind of actually own the intellectual property and kind of cloud native backup that Caston and K10 really provided. But let's talk a little bit about, kind of the cloud provider backup solutions. And Mike, that's one of those things where, is it just because it's the path of least resistance, right? You're in AWS, you're doing EKS, you've got your Kubernetes there. You just kind of click the button and say, yep, we're going to, use this stuff for backup. Is it, things that folks have to do? Is it as simple as, just making a click from that standpoint, or is there still work to do in order to, kind of leverage AWS's capabilities there?
I mean, this, I would say that for this topic, it really is like a matter of convenience for a lot of the backup that we see in, the static volumes that are kind of attached to compute nodes. But when it comes to like the actual backup of your cluster data and the workload piece, that's something that we don't have native. So we actually, would be recommending a partner like Caston for actually saving down those, that cluster state in that application and then kind of restoring it, which is, why they were one of our launch partners with our kind of EKS blueprints, program, because we want them right there, on that cluster to help enable that best practice, where we don't have the capacity for that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, right? And some folks may actually utilize, kind of Caston as the partner, not realizing that it's maybe a separate thing because they buy it through the marketplace or what have you. So, you could have some conflation there. But Matt, you kind of look at that and go, mix of cloud and on-prem backup solutions. That's kind of, the strategy, right? I mean, that's what you guys have built, and you really do that. So how many folks, again, where they're already a big Veeam customer, and then they bring you guys in because they're starting to play around with cloud native? Is that a lot of what you're doing, or is it, still a mix of, folks that are cloud native are going and they're finding you guys separately and then thinking about, well, we got all this other crap we got to deal with on-prem, and maybe it's a little bit of a bi-directional thing as well?
Yeah, interesting question. Also very, very timely. So I'm at actually EBC today, where we had one of our sales leaders address that question specifically. And yeah, it's interesting as we see, as part of the Veeam family, I definitely seen a lot of enterprises that are now adopting Kubernetes or starting to dip their toes. And the nice thing is, Veeam can easily say, hey, look, we've got a cloud native solution for that. We know you're playing with EKS or maybe on-prem, and at the same time, I think if anyone in the audience has been to KubeCon or some of those other big conferences, from a Caston perspective, there's kind of that name recognition separately. So it's the good news is we're seeing it come from both sides. Obviously, the audience is a little bit different. So this survey was interesting to me to see, and this is common, traditional on-prem backup solutions, but at 12%. Obviously, Kubernetes is different. So trying to back up VMs or, that's running your containers or your worker pods or worker nodes, that will not necessarily restore, right? So a big component of this is making sure that not only can you back up your infrastructure, can you restore it? And then to kind of Mike's point as well, as we're starting to embrace cloud native and Kubernetes, whether on-prem or, there's EKSD, EKS Anywhere, the beauty of Caston as well as the data mobility component, right? So the ability to actually move workloads from one cluster to another and scale. And, I guess good example, and you brought this up earlier, Mike, too, is oftentimes, backups are not thought of until they're needed. Yeah. And obviously ransomware is becoming more and more an issue. I think we're seeing over 87% of most enterprises have experienced some sort of ransomware, at least attempt attack in the last year. And obviously backups are really big, hitting that button to restore is huge. So for that 17% on the bottom, keep that back in your mind. Maybe try not to rely on divine intervention.
Yeah. And I think that brings up the last point. Then we got a couple of questions I want to hit, but manual scripts and processes, right? So this is, your typical early market DIY type things, the folks that on the weekends, what'd you do? Oh, I built an extension on my house. Right. Got it. Okay. You're that person. I totally understand. That's fine. All good. Right. But I mean, let's kind of be clear. Right. When you're dealing with a handful of pods, right, a couple of different applications, you can probably get away with a little bit of Python and, some API calls. Right. But as you want to scale this thing up, having to be in the software business, which you're already being, kind of whatever those workloads are, kind of being in the software business on the maintenance side. I mean, there's going to be some limitations. I mean, Matt, do you spend some time ripping out, kind of folks, are you kind of the guy who comes in, yep, we got to go fix this one because they thought they could do it themselves, freaking engineers.
So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the good news from a sales perspective and, kind of adopting of customers is we often see customers that, start kind of this path, whether it's roll your own scripts or try to use an open source solution, which to your point, sometimes you don't need that scale and it works initially. And obviously, especially if it's, Kubernetes is kind of in that, engineer centric space. So, and a lot of us, myself included, like open source and like to tinker. But at the end of the day, we've had a significant number of customers approach us and just realize that, this is not scalable. This is not enterprise ready. And one of my favorite expressions is, an open source solution, open source Kubernetes backup solution is free like a puppy. It's easy to clone GitHub or, clone the project and start rolling your own, but it's a lot of care and feeding. And, You also tend to see maybe it's 1 to 2 people writing scripts or maintaining this, and what happens, if well, hopefully, if they end up leaving the company, we'll say that way, or if a bus is involved, you got to make sure that it's easier to make it enterprise ready.
No, and that's a great point. So, again, similar to folks don't realize that their backup strategy is insufficient until they realize their backup strategy is insufficient. They don't realize the dependence that they put on a handful of individuals building a bunch of these scripts until they leave. Right, or until something breaks. Right, I mean, even small companies, right? We've got 30 people at Techstrong, and a handful of folks are in tech, and one of our internal dashboards that we report on, we had some challenges because our data provider changed their API, and we're sitting there scrambling because we had an intern write it 2 summers ago. Right, that intern is long gone at this point. Even if we could find him, I'm not sure he would remember exactly what he did from that standpoint. So guess what? We get to rewrite that, kind of integration. So again, I just want to make the point of, just going with your eyes open, right? Understanding that is a solution when you're getting going, because you may not have a lot of budget to go and spend on commercial efforts. But when you start talking about business critical workloads, when you start talking about things that you run your business on, a script, something that's brittle, something that I got to maintain, something it just doesn't feel good to me. Right. And I don't know, I get to be an old guy. I like to sleep at night. Right. I like to have some, quality of life and not get called into the office when, something goes haywire, and it never goes haywire at like 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. Right. It's only like 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday. Right. When you're maybe not in this position to, go and go into the office and start troubleshooting, stuff. Because I don't know, maybe a football game or something that started early. You're a Southeastern guy, Matt. You may understand, something about that. But let's kind of talk a little bit about, kind of just backup practices, right? So the next question we asked is, how often do you perform backup operations for your Kubernetes workloads, right? And to me, this was, kind of interesting just to get a sense of, how on top of things are folks. One, what kind of workloads are these? Are they, constantly churning and requiring, kind of ongoing backup? So, we had 36% said daily, right? At least daily, 26% weekly, 9% said monthly. And again, 29% says as needed, which in my experience means probably never, maybe sometimes, and typically not soon enough after you've had some kind of issue. But, folks have to learn that kind of stuff the hard way. So, Matt, you're knee deep in this stuff every day with customers. That representative, or, again, because they're dealing with you guys, there may be, kind of more at the front end of it, saying, yep, we really take this seriously. We do that. I mean, do you have folks that just do monthly, kind of backups on their environment?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it depends on their maturity in terms of what applications are deployed to Kubernetes, right? So for the enterprises or customers or prospects, I'll say, that are kind of dipping their toes, obviously ad hoc or monthly, maybe enough. But at the same time, we've come into enterprises, and again, part of the reason they come knocking on our door is that, even daily is not frequent enough, right? Especially if these are business critical apps, you have SLAs, you have RTO, RPO targets. You need to make sure that you've got a solution that can support that. And also a solution that, that's one thing that we also sometimes see is, it's not a one size fits all when it comes to backups, right? So you need to make sure you index and prioritize, because it's, backup is part of a disaster recovery, which is part of business continuity. So having a business continuity plan and understanding your priority of applications and what sort of RPO, RTO requirements the business has obviously helps dictate these frequencies here.
Yeah, and I would guess you spend some time working with customers to help them understand that, I don't have to do everything. Not everything has to be every hour, right? Some workloads may actually be able to be, monthly. I don't like the ad hoc thing, but that's just my, kind of, OCD in there going, no, it can't be there, kind of 1 inch to the left, right? So not having a strategy usually means not anything happens. So I don't love, kind of that option on that front. But again, I think an important, nuance here is that, you should be evaluating kind of the resilience plan for every specific application. Right. It's not a one size fits all type thing. You want to have the infrastructure to be able to support whatever frequency makes sense to you. right? It makes sense for that workload, but you don't have to do everything. So similar type of experience, Mike, or do you not get that deep with some of the clients?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the frequency of the backups with some of the folks, because, with my work on best practices, and helping instruct on that, like, you'd be surprised at how many times I do get that ad hoc. Well, I guess you wouldn't based on the data here. It's more frequent than I would like to have folks come in and go, well, that wasn't really in scope for what we were building, or like, it's not that important to us to have, these backed up. And as part of a kind of a well-architected solution, we would expect for there to be some RTO or RPO, even if, you can lose a decent amount of data, as long as you've thought about it and are having some sort of backup contingency just to have business continuity for, your users or your customers. So yeah, we're definitely seeing, I mean, folks that are trying to tailor it to their specific applications, but then also a big contingency that are kind of not thinking about it until they need it. And I mean, usually that ends up being that they're not thinking about it until they want to back something up, and then they go, "Oh no, we should have been taking those snapshots."
Yep. And as you guys know, once you miss that backup window, so to speak, that data is gone and you ain't getting it back. Right? You ain't getting it back on that front. So we did have a couple of questions. I forgot to get them on the last question, but I think it is still appropriate to this one. So, first one, it says, as companies are finding sense to move to containers and cloud. And I think there are a lot of reasons for why, cloud and containers is interesting. And I think, again, a big contributing factor is the reality that walking into a data center and racking and stacking devices and managing all of that, hardware and that equipment is just something that, again, for a couple of months in 2020, we literally couldn't do, right? And now, in 2023, a couple of years later, we don't want to, right? We just don't want to. So I think there are a lot of advantages to having somebody else or the robots or whatever AWS has going on back there to make all that stuff work. It's magic, and I don't quite get it, but it seems to work because every time I get into the console and clickety click a little bit, stuff happens. So some Oompa Loompas are back there, doing some work, and I win because I got to use Oompa Loompa in an event today. So that is one of my measures of success. But the other question is something that I do think is something we want to deal with, right? And it's really the crux of it is, how do we ensure backups on your on-prem Kubernetes environment? Both if you run them as separate infrastructures, and if you maybe use something, this person references Google's Anthos as kind of an abstraction layer. Obviously, we could look at VMware. We could look at, IBM has one with Redshift or Openshift as the way to do that, kind of underlying it. So how does that, let's call it multi-cloud or multi-platform or hybrid, right, or all of the above, really impact what your backup and resilience strategy needs to be? Right. So Matt, I'll point that to you since you're okay. You're allowed to say the word multi-cloud and hybrid and not get into trouble. We'll focus on AWS in a second.
Awesome. That sounds good. Well, and to be fair, AWS can say that, with their EKSD or EKS Anywhere, they can do multi-cloud as well.
We can do multi-cloud as long as it's AWS, right?
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
That's fair. But yeah, no, I mean, I guess that's a beautiful thing about Caston or Caston by Veeam is that, we are a Kubernetes native app. So as long as you have a Kubernetes environment, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, you can deploy us and we can back up workloads. We can interrogate workloads, right? Because we're in that Kubernetes cluster, we can see new namespaces. So talk about from a CI/CD or from a developer or DevOps, pipeline. If your developers are deploying new namespaces or new apps, you don't need somebody constantly checking. Right? We have the ability to automatically apply policies and back up those workloads. And then also, as you mentioned, Mike, in terms of that kind of hybrid multi-cloud, because we're Kubernetes native, we can obviously replicate the storage that we're backing up, right? So without setting up ghosts here to take down, but one thing that we often hear is, Kubernetes is ephemeral. We don't have any data, or I back up at CD. And we're actually seeing quite the opposite, right? And talk about as enterprises adopt more and more enterprise workloads, we are seeing persistent data more and more. This isn't 2016 anymore. We are seeing quite a bit around stateful workloads and seeing databases being deployed in Kubernetes. And ability to move those amidst clouds. And obviously that's one great story we have with Amazon is, the ability we often see, or we will help a lot of customers who are, their developers are deploying maybe something locally on K3S or some sort of small environment. But when it comes time for production, they need the ability to scale and obviously have the multi-region capabilities that EKS provides. So Caston can be that data mobilization layer, right? Because we're Kubernetes native, we can take snaps of that data, replicate it over, and basically reseed it and bring it up over in EKS.
Got it. Mike, any other difference, or Matt kind of slammed that one because I think he probably did.
Oh, I mean, he definitely covered most of what I was that's why I was nodding along so much there. But I love that use case of being able to move those workloads from, a cluster that you have on-prem or local or something, and then up into the cloud. Because one thing that we see pretty often is, if we've got somebody with EKS Anywhere that's in their own data center, they're trying to use up the rest of the useful life on those server racks that they've already stacked. And then they have some dev test there, like those environments, and then want to move it into production that's going to be on the cloud, like using a backup and recovery solution like Veeam to move that over into production, makes it super quick.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned kind of portability, right? Because we're about to embark on some new research that's really focused on, we can talk about portability, we can talk about it as multi-cloud, right? We can talk about it as cloud native, but really, I think part of one of the challenges, and Mike, hold your ears for a second here, right? But again, as you get bigger, right, kind of bigger customers, they do get worried about being locked into a certain platform. Right. So, this idea of having both tooling and processes to be able to think about how their workloads are going to, potentially move. Although I'll let you in on a little secret, they very rarely do it. Right. They want to plan for it. They very rarely actually move. They want to know that they can if they need to, but they usually don't. Right. So that ends up being as much an architectural thing as it is a real production thing. On that front. But listen, anytime we're trying to do this stuff, there's always going to be challenges, right? So we asked folks about a couple of different things that would, kind of stop them or create some challenges as they're moving these business critical applications to Kubernetes, right? We asked them, again, what challenges do you face? Lack of Kubernetes and cloud native skills, right? 29%. I think we've mentioned it 4 or 5 times already. It's a new technology. It is, again, we just don't have the infrastructure that's there to support that. Not surprising at all, right? And then we kind of had a bunch of, them in the not a skills gap, kind of issue. Resources required to migrate applications from traditional infrastructure. And again, part of that is resource, right? Part of that is skills. Part of it is also the fact that it's resource intensive. So Mike, you were talking about that, right? Just moving data from a traditional infrastructure up to the cloud. I remember I was at one of the reInvents many moons ago where they drove, kind of the tractor trailer on with the, I forget what they call snow plow, or maybe that's snow plow.
I think the big tractor trailer is snowmobile.
Snowmobile, right?
So they got a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, you're sitting in Vegas, and they literally drive a tractor trailer full of these, kind of things to help you migrate your data on that front. So that's obviously going to be pretty resource intensive, right? Monitoring and troubleshooting containerized applications, again, especially in that multi-cloud type of environment. And, we can talk about troubleshooting, we talk about monitoring, but again, what about things like backup, right? Kind of backup and doing that across that. We were just talking about that, right? Securing the containerized environment that, we could do probably 3 or 4 days on the nuances of securing Kubernetes as opposed to, kind of your traditional on-prem environment. And then ensuring adequate performance when scaling production workloads, right? And that's where it starts to get into art versus science, because there's a lot of different ways. And, in the old days, we'd just throw hardware at it and just, buy a couple more racks, right? Wait for them to show up and they get installed. And that's what your scalability is. Now there's a whole bunch of other nuance, right? How do we start to expand the pods, right? When do we start to, build out? Is it horizontal scaling? Is it vertical scaling? Probably both, right? Kind of site reliability engineering or SRE, kind of the nuance of being able to do that. Again, kind of rated last, but that's mostly because, again, I think that we've got at least a third to a half of folks that are still early in their journey, right? As they get a little bit more mature, very clearly, they're going to be like, oh yeah, this scaling thing is kind of hard, right? And it's not just, hey, we can Fargate the crap out of everything, but, at the end of the day, you still have to, have those nuances there. So Mike, out of those things, which one jumps out at you is, yeah, this is a huge problem that either folks are under appreciating, based upon these numbers, or, here's something that, is coming down the pike and, you better be ready for it.
And I feel like the resources required and that lack of skills are probably the most daunting to some of our customers and partners, because they, sometimes they get in this mindset where they feel like they need to boil the ocean and try and move so much stuff over at once, or go straight for business critical. And like, one of the things we always tell them is you can start with something small, start with something that, if you do have issues, it's not going to take down the whole site, and then kind of build up from there. And I think that could be kind of why we see, such ambitious ramp up with folks that do the hockey stick, where they go, all right, we're going to move 40 apps and then 100 apps and then 400 apps, because they kind of are a little bit further along that learning curve and go, oh, okay, we figured out some of the scaling on the smaller stuff and now we can move up. But yeah, when it comes to the business critical stuff, there's definitely like, a desire to get it right the first time, obviously. And it can be a little bit scary for folks that are just kind of moving towards that.
You bet. Matt, before I kind of turn over you, just to clarify on that, Mike, that's their plans, right? Yeah. Their plans are to go 40, 100, 400, right? What they end up doing, usually it's a lot less because, in reality of some of these things. But Matt, what jumps out at you about, some of these numbers here?
Yeah, I mean, again, this aligns certainly with what we see. And you mentioned obviously the skill set here. So I come from an infrastructure background, like I said, physical and virtual, and even for myself to ramp up on Kubernetes, right? I'm still learning every day, and there's the ecosystem so large, which is both, to Mike's point, it's exciting, and there's a lot of solutions. It's also daunting. So trying to choose the right right tooling and making sure you've got the right systems in place. So I'm going to lock into kind of the monitoring, troubleshooting, and securing. So there's, to kind of to join arms there with Mike, but, we support AWS Guard Duty. That's a good example of in terms of helping monitor and troubleshoot your Kubernetes environment. And then also, obviously end-to-end encryption is really important, obviously in this day and age. So we also integrate with Amazon's customer managed keys, right? So we're seeing this crop up more and more for obvious reasons. So really important, that these are two things that we're addressing today in our product, and we're currently actually, from a product perspective, very much focused on, these issues, as well as kind of the ransomware and malware stories as well, making sure we're helping our customers.
Well, right. So one is kind of the why, and then the other is kind of the how, right? Mm-hmm. And how you end up doing it on the back end. And to be clear, this is something that we've been, tracking pretty closely too on the Techstrong Research side. So early in the year, we did our basically our trends, right? We have cloud native trends every year. And one of them was, really about the enterprise maturity of the tool sets that are there to help you adopt cloud native. That really is a constraint to adoption. And that's shown, right here, which is until folks get comfortable with their ability to build what is a scalable and resilient environment that is on par with what they have had for years for those business critical applications, they're not going to move, right? And I think that if you've seen that, that's where the partnership between, Caston by Veeam and AWS and all of AWS's modernization partners are really focused around building the environment and the foundation that customers can feel comfortable moving their most critical workloads to that platform, right? Until they get there, right? Until they can make that decision, say, I'm betting my career on this, they're not going to, right? They're just not going to. So we continue to want to see more maturity. We are seeing additional, solutions of maturity, but the reality is until that perception of a solution that can, if not equal, really kind of go past what I can get with my traditional infrastructure. Again, I think we're very much, sitting in the same, kind of purgatory where we're playing around with it in the lab, but we've still got hundreds of workloads and applications that are, kind of wasting away in their existing, kind of environments and jails on that front. So I'll get off my soapbox. So we asked, which cloud platform. So predictably, it looks an awful lot like what you see from all the market share guys, right? AWS number 1, Azure number 2, Google Platform number 3. Interestingly, private cloud on-prem, right, number 9. So again, folks are using existing hardware in their data centers to start playing around and learning with and even deploying Kubernetes. And again, depending on the types of regulations they have, depending on the requirements of those workloads, I think we see that. And then we have a whole mix of other stuff, right? Oracle in there, Alibaba, DigitalOcean. So we have 5% no cloud providers, so they must have gotten lost somewhere. This one we posted on Cloud Native Now, our cloud native infrastructure. So some of those folks may be lost on that front. So we don't have to dig into that. What I really want to dig into is the next one, right? So supporting of the platforms, the actual Kubernetes environment. So, here EKS 28%, again, that's good to see, especially since, Mike probably has some options that he wants to see continue to, rise in value. So more EKS, better than less EKS for sure on that front. But, then second, AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes service, right? Kind of in there, not third, but, close is the Google Kubernetes engine or GKE. So those managed services, right? Kind of from the platform standpoint, again, that it's easier for customers, so they're doing it. And we see a bunch of OpenShift, and again, I think a lot of that, is kind of legacy or traditional infrastructure, and those folks have had IBM in there or Red Hat in there from very early on, so they adopt OpenShift on that front. Is this representative, Matt, of what you run into in the field? A little bit of this, a little bit of that?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I'd say what we're seeing from a Caston by Veeam perspective, we definitely see a lot of OpenShift, actually more than I think we see in this chart. But I will say, from a joint solution, and obviously I'm in Red Hat's offices, so you can't see the person, but I've got a whip just outside the. No, there.
You better say nice things about OpenShift.
there is a joint. There's a Red Hat. ROSA, basically Red Hat OpenShift offering on AWS. So that's something that we're, from a Caston by Veeam perspective, are very interested in as well. And we're seeing more and more customers adopt that. Talk about a managed service. The benefit of that, obviously, is if you have a hybrid cloud environment, you can have OpenShift as that common interface on top of your Kubernetes instance. And then obviously by using something like ROSA on AWS, you're not managing it out in the cloud. But yeah, generally this aligns to what we see. EKS by and large, they're kind of our next. Well, I shouldn't say next. EKS by large is the number one Kubernetes distribution we're running into.
You bet. So Mike, from your standpoint, let's talk a little bit about what you guys do in order to facilitate multi-cloud, hybrid cloud. I mean, obviously it's a big world and you can't, have everybody being a homogeneous, AWS environment as much as you would like that to be, right? So obviously, Amazon and AWS is always focused on open standards. Well, what other stuff do you do to, kind of give folks that comfort that, this isn't a one-way door, and, when you do things on EKS, at some point you can work and play nice with some of these other distributions, some of these other platforms?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is with our EKS Anywhere kind of console environment, you can install an agent and kind of view your resources from other clusters, even on other cloud providers within the EKS console. So you can kind of use that to manage all your different clusters if you choose to have, some on EKS, some on, OpenShift, some on Google Cloud. anything that's the kind of Kubernetes like conformant cluster is going to be able to work and be visible from there. Now, you can't exactly control it from, that view because we don't have our hands in, everybody else's stuff, but, it does kind of allow for a more unified viewing of the resources that you do have running. And I mean, we try our best to kind of facilitate, folks being able to use and run whatever they'd like. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of running a container infrastructure, right? Is the portability of your container images. And, we try and have our EKS offering be as, it's upstream Kubernetes at the end of the day. So you'll have that same interface and that same kind of experience, running on our platform as you would elsewhere. So just trying to really take down, the amount of work that it is for teams to be running multi-cloud with that.
Yeah, you bet. Good. And that's, I think what everybody wanted to hear, Mike, again, it's not a one-way door. We can definitely, kind of focus on, again, doing the right stuff from a Kubernetes standpoint. And then, again, if the platform is there, great. If I've got to move it for whatever reason, great on that front. Okay. So next, target mean time to recover or restore, right? Depending on what flavor you are, you get the R's all confused on that. Maybe it should be MTTRR. That would get very confusing. So we're not going to go there. In case of a disaster or system failure, right? 34% say less than an hour. They want to be up and running in an hour. Another 34% say 1 to 4 hours. So a pretty significant majority need to be back up and running within 4 hours. 15% are right at more than 12 hours, 9%. How much pressure, Matt, are you guys getting to, really kind of compress that restore, recover time frame? And what are the customers really willing to do in order to, make that happen?
Yeah, good question. And yeah, it's one of those things too, where when we first walk into many customers, obviously, like we kind of alluded to earlier, a lot of customers say, hey, I want everything to be backed up and recoverable, with my RTO under a minute, right? So what we try to say is, look, that is possible, but it's kind of that cost benefit, obviously from an underlying infrastructure, from a Caston perspective, it actually, we are dependent on the underlying storage, right? So you're going to need performance storage and capacity as well. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly, especially enterprises, for good reason, this aligns with what we see. Less than 1 hour for enterprise business critical apps. If you're retail, if your POSs are down, you're not selling, or if you're an airline, and you're not, your air flight control system's down, you're not letting planes take off. So yeah, yeah. But yeah, no, for sure. This aligns kind of what we see in the field. I think a lot of it is just, hey, from a larger business continuity plan, our mean time to recovery targets need to align with the criticality of our systems. And, can we look at this more holistically as well? What can be potentially handled on a paper-based, solution versus what, is your core business system that needs that minimal recovery time.
Yeah. Mike, similar feedback on your experience?
Yeah, I would say so. With a lot of the partners that I work with, it's going to be really tailored to the specific kind of workload, but if it's business critical, then they're shooting for under an hour, and 1 to 4 being, even kind of stretching it out there a little ways. Like, we want this system back up and running so that our people don't have a disruption of service.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is, when you look at some of these architectural ideas for how to do stuff, right? Kind of the idea is we shouldn't have any downtime, right? That you can start to architect things in a different way. If you're lifting and shifting, there's so much you can do on that front. I think the important thing for our audience out there is to understand that, you can sit in a meeting and somebody can say, yep, our target is less than an hour. But to Matt's point, if you don't have the underlying capability there in order to do it, in meaning the performance storage, meaning the capacity to keep things, meaning, the ability to have, kind of replicated data in different places, or some type of sophisticated synchronization across regions or cloud providers or whatever it is, you ain't going to get there, right? You're just not going to get there unless you're willing to do that. So it's great to sit in a meeting and say, we got to be there, right? And then there's something else in order, to actually make that happen in reality. So just keep that in mind when somebody, kind of in the executive level comes in and says, we've got to be there for an hour. The impetus on any of us as, kind of practitioners or operators is to make sure that we're saying, yes, but, right? If you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have the tools to do it across a multi-cloud environment, if you don't have some of the capabilities that you need in order to make that happen, it's not going to. And again, don't be shocked when that turns out to be the case. So we'll wrap up our data, right? The data portion of our show here with, what are some of the most important features to have in a Kubernetes backup and restore solution. So we asked folks to, rank things. So that number is really a composite number there. Number one ranked, and they were 1 and 2, close. So depending on where in the horse race, we kind of set the finish line. This is, but, they're very clearly, kind of 1A and 1B, right? Integration with existing tools, processes, and vendor technology. Duh. I mean, if you've got certain, kind of enterprise applications, you got to make sure that you can back that stuff up, right? If you're using certain storage kinds or compute, environments or, other kind of memory or high performance, this, that, or the other thing, you got to make sure that that happens. And the other piece of it was easy to use interface, right? And to me, that's kind of, that's indicative of a lot of different things. One, the maturity of the market, because as we kind of said with the manual scripting, and if you're a tool belt person and you don't have any problem getting a command line and scripting and all sorts of stuff, in a lot of cases you hate the interface because it won't do things exactly the way you want it to. But it's also, again, indicative as you mature in the environment, you have folks that don't want to build their own stuff. They want the UX to reflect the way they want to do things and to build stuff. So I thought that was very interesting. Scalability, reliability, security, but to me, those top two were really, kind of interesting in that it's an important aspect of that. So Matt, tell me a little bit about, your experience with new customers, kind of figuring out, the Caston by Veeam UX, right? Intuitive. It's so powerful that kind of it takes a little while to learn it. So where did kind of a lot of the folks you work with come down on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and before I answer, I'll just say this is probably one of my favorite charts of all of them. This, obviously from a Caston perspective, this all plays very well kind of into our strengths. So yeah, to answer your question about the UI, it's easy enough that I'll say when I first started and, thought I knew Kubernetes, but realized it was just a drop in the ocean, I was able to start backing up workloads almost immediately. Right? So again, because we're Kubernetes native or we're deployed within Kubernetes, we can see, resources within Kubernetes and we can protect namespaces, right? So super simple to set up policies. I think you can do it in technically under 3 or 4 clicks. So that makes it much easier. And I think back to one of our earlier points too, in terms of those that are not particularly comfortable with Kubernetes or cloud native, by having that kind of friendly interface, I think that makes it much easier, or at the very least, there's less time spent, having to run kubectl commands or playing around with YAML. But that being said, to your point, the integration with existing tools processes, because we are Kubernetes native, everything that you do in the UI, you can export the YAML for. So everyone loves some good space delineation. So if you love YAML, you can do everything via YAML, and it's completely extensible. So
who doesn't love YAML?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll show. So in a previous life, I was a web developer, and I'll say actually I really prefer XML. So, but even the pre-JSON days. So
old school, I prefer COBOL, but no, I'm not going to go there. Mike, any comments on kind of our little ranking here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as far as the easy to use interface goes, like what we're seeing a lot is folks that are trying to get away from spending a lot of their time like building up that infrastructure and doing that hands-on stuff so that they can focus on the apps and like the actual software that they're building. Yeah, we're definitely seeing a demand for ease of use in that respect, so that they don't have to have this whole learning curve of picking up another tool set and figuring out how to do that backup and recovery. So yeah, and then integration with our existing vendor tech and everything, it kind of goes in the same hand in hand. Like they don't want to spend a bunch of time and sink a lot of effort and resources into linking it up with where they already have their applications running.
That's great. So alas, we could probably go for another hour or so and debate a number of these topics, but I'm sure everybody has a whole mess of work that they need to do on their own front. So before I hand it back to Cody, let me kind of go through a little bit. Here is the pulse meter, right? So you can actually see not just these charts, but the context around the charts and some commentary from yours truly, but don't tell anybody, to kind of get, again, a view of where we think things are going and why this is an important aspect of that. So that is up in the handout section of the webinar interface that you have right there. We've got a couple of events coming up. So in the middle of next month, August 16th is our Data Ops Day. So focusing on all sorts of things, including backup and resilience. So we will be talking about that as a topic. We've got our Digital CXO Summit on September 13th, and that's really about business transformation. So you can check all of the Techstrong events at techstrongevents.com just to see what we have. We do at least one a month. We're actually doing a digital certificate event as well in August, since that's not a niche-y enough thing for you. But if you get your work, and it's one of those things where if you have that problem, it's not niche-y at all. It kind of consumes everything that you do. If you don't, you're like, why the hell am I even talking about that? But suffice to say, there are a number of folks that are doing that on that front. So with that, let's turn it back over to Cody, who will give away some gift cards, because everybody loves gift cards. That's why you're still here.
That's right. So we'll just go ahead and lead with our winners. Our winners are Melind P, Richard T, Lukogo L, and Rajiv G. So to our 4 winners, keep an eye on your email to claim your gift card. We will contact you in the next 48 hours. But if you don't happen to see that email, check your spam folder on the off chance that it happens to get filtered out. I'd like to also remind everyone that our session was recorded. You will be receiving the recording via email shortly after we conclude. You can also find it living on the Cloud Native Now website at cloudnativenow.com/webinars. So to Matt, Mike, and Mike, thank you 3 for joining us today. It was such a pleasure speaking with you beforehand. I'd like to give a big shout out to AWS and Caston by Veeam for sponsoring our program today. I'd like to give some credit to Techstrong Research for conducting the polls and surveys that went into our PostMeter report. And to our audience, thank you so much for sticking around with us. We really appreciate your time, and we do want to hear your feedback. I've attached a link to the chat to funnel you into our post-web survey. But if you just stick around, you'll also be funneled there as well. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. Matt, Mike, and Mike, it was a pleasure. Everyone, you may now disconnect.
Thanks, everyone.